Alrighty, well, hello everybody. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And I'm so honored we have two returning champions back on the program. We are joined by Thomas Peters and John Braddock, who are both part of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, and they are frequent contributors to the World Socialist website, where they cover New Zealand topics. And yes, and this is our all things New Zealand edition. We're going to be talking about the last general election in New Zealand, which saw the end of the Labour Party and their coalition partners, and we now have a new right wing. The Labour Party is a right wing is a right wing party, but we have a much more outwardly far right coalition government making up of the National Party, and that's New Zealand's version of what the Conservative Party is in Canada, Britain, the Liberal National Coalition in Australia, and the Republican Party of the United States, and their coalition partners are the ACT Party, which is a Libertarian Party, and New Zealand First, and we're going to get into all of that for our Australian audience. Winston Peters, of course, is the Kiwi Maori version of Pauline Hanson, which is so weird to say, but it is what it is. So, so first off, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks very much, Youri. Yeah, always good to talk to you.
Likewise. So, all right, so gentlemen, let's get started. So, my first question before we get into the election autopsy is Jacinda Ardern. She was widely perceived as a very popular Labour leader, a female progressive leader, and then she suddenly resigned, and then she was replaced by Chris Hipkins. And I just wanted to know, why did this seemingly progressive leader, Jacinda Ardern, which many people say handled the pandemic much better than much of the Western developed world, what was that about? And then why was Labour unable to retain its power in the last general election? Oh yes. Oh, and I should also say. So we'll start. So we'll start with Thomas first, and then John can. And then John can respond.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, it's a big question, of course, and I mean, just to start with, we have always, I think, in fact, it's correct to say the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand and the World Socialist website has been alone in warning about the right-wing character of Ardern and her Labour government ever since it was first formed in 2017. And there was a real, what was called Jacinda mania in that election, which was largely just a media phenomenon. It wasn't some sort of groundswell of support in the working class or the mass of the population. The Labour Party actually barely got in that election, barely got into power, and only thanks to a coalition that it formed with the right-wing nationalist NZ First, New Zealand First. So the Labour government, headed by this supposedly progressive woman in her 30s, who was also pregnant, one of the first pregnant leaders, and there was a whole media campaign about how brilliant that was for female representation. But her government relied entirely on a coalition with the most racist right-wing party in the New Zealand Parliament, New Zealand First, whose leader, Winston Peters, was made the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. And that was, a reactionary, anti-immigrant coalition government, and one that strengthened ties with the United States, military ties, It also, in terms of, it supported the NATO war against Russia and over Ukraine, and encouraged the United States to send more of its resources into the Pacific in the build-up to war against China. And this government also, by the way, included the Green Party, along with Labour and the right-wing New Zealand First. So it was never a progressive government, but as I say...
But wasn't the Maori Party also part of her coalition government the first time around?
No, it wasn't. The Maori Party is another subject that we can get into maybe later, but they were actually they were unable to get any seats in 2017, largely because they had been in a coalition with the right-wing Conservative National Party for many years, and had been exposed as just another right-wing pro-business party, and which is what they are. They're now back in Parliament, but for at least 2017 to 2020, they were not. So this was a right-wing government, and we were really alone in warning about that. All throughout its first 3 years, Ardern was, glorified at every opportunity. Possibly even before the pandemic, there was the terrorist attack in 2019
Yes.
in Christchurch, where Brenton Tarrant murdered 51 Muslims in 2 mosques, and Jacinda Ardern, because she, made some noises about how kind she was glorified as some sort of Mother Teresa figure by the world's media, especially in the United States. And we made the point that, of course, Labour, as well as the National Party, had been totally complicit in stoking anti-Muslim sentiments and going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and not to mention the fact that she was in a coalition with New Zealand First, which was an extremely anti-Muslim party, and had a really filthy record of trying to whip up xenophobia and racism against people from the Middle East and Asia and India and China and etc. So that was her deputy prime minister. All of that was overlooked by as she was turned into a celebrity in the world's media. I think it's interesting to consider, the role that Ardern played in the world, in US politics and in British politics and Australian politics. She was sort of presented as some sort of evidence that, there's nothing really wrong with the system. We just need a leader like Ardern, and she was embraced. I mean, people like Bernie Sanders embraced her in the United States as a model for America. Sorry?
Jeremy Corbyn as well in Britain, and
yes.
Jacobin magazine.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so
Jacobin magazine, yeah, a whole range of people. Now, so moving forward a few more years, in the 2020, when COVID broke out in 2020, and we've talked about this before, she, of course, implemented one of the world's strictest lockdown policies and border control measures. And as a result, COVID was eliminated. This was again used to glorify her, of course, but it was only done in response to a real threat by the a real threat of an uprising actually among nurses and healthcare workers who in the space of just 3 or 4 days, signed a petition that gained tens of thousands of signatures, demanding a lockdown and supporting people such as Michael Baker, the epidemiologist who was calling for that. And there was a possibility that the situation could really get out of hand. So Ardern, who had initially opposed a lockdown, this is in March 2020, changed her position in a very short space of time, from opposing it to supporting a strict lockdown, and thus brought the whole situation under control and prevented what took place in the United States, in Italy, and other parts of the world, which was, people walking out of factories and going on strike, and demanding basic measures to stop the spread of the virus. So that did not happen in New Zealand, and the lockdowns were to prevent that. Of course, New Zealand wasn't unique, and obviously China had the most successful policy in terms of eliminating COVID-19. Again, I think because of the threat that if it did not do that, there would be an explosion in the Chinese working class that the government would not be able to control. So, we should no more glorify Ardern for what she did than we should glorify the Chinese Communist Party, which we certainly don't. So, nevertheless, they were scientific measures that were adopted and succeeded, and that we support, and we certainly say that both New Zealand and China, and also Australia, which largely eliminated COVID, prove that can be done. And if those measures were adopted on a world scale, we would no longer have COVID, and the pandemic would be over. Instead, we have an endless pandemic and endless deaths. And one of the people responsible for that is Jacinda Ardern, because she also played the key role in dismantling all of the measures to eliminate COVID towards the end of 2021, after Labour had been re-elected in 2020 with an historic landslide victory, where it gained more than 50% of the votes and was able to form a government by itself without any support parties. That was all on the strength of its COVID response. I mean, inequality was getting worse, poverty was getting worse. There had been strikes in 2018 and 2019 by teachers and healthcare workers. So there was a cost of living crisis. There was a crisis in the health system, which would have absolutely collapsed if COVID had been allowed in 2020. So there was plenty of discontent and anger among workers, but nonetheless, workers the COVID-19 elimination policy was extremely popular, and that is the main reason why the Labour Party got re-elected, I think. So, and then its popularity began to sharply decline after Jacinda Ardern removed the COVID elimination policy at the end of 2021. So there's a direct correlation there, which by the way, I think we're again the only people to point this out. The narrative in the media is basically that people, the reason Labour lost so much last year, according to the New Zealand Herald and everyone else in the media, is to do with two things: the COVID-19 response. People turned against the restrictions supposedly, and they also acknowledged that people were unhappy with the cost of living, which is certainly true, but it's simply false that people opposed the lockdowns, and that people sort of wanted a policy of mass infection and thousands of deaths. All of the evidence points to the exact opposite. As I say, the popularity of the Labour government and of Ardern personally declined very sharply in 2022, just as all of the hospitals were overflowing with patients, and people started dying in large numbers from COVID-19. So that's part of the answer to why Labour lost. Certainly there's more that could be said about inequality, and I can go into that if you like.
Just before you get into that, so I find that answer quite fascinating, because indeed, and because unfortunately there's not many left-wing news outlets that cover New Zealand topics, and because a lot of this is a whole nother topic for a whole nother day, but because a lot of left-leaning people, we were talking off the air actually about this, who have been playing footsie with the far right, the depiction was that the official narrative is that Ardern and the Labour Party were too restrictive in their in their lockdowns, in their mask mandates, and in their vaccine mandates. There were protests that broke out in New Zealand, as they broke out in a lot of the Western developed world, of people who did of people who didn't want to take the vaccine, and the anti-vax extremist movement certainly gained a lot of momentum, and it didn't help that a lot of left-leaning people propped these guys up. This very extreme libertarian libertarian approach to a pandemic. So, but anywho, I find that quite interesting that no, actually in general people were supportive. What people weren't supportive was her lifting those restrictions, not confronting the anti-vax reactionary extremist movement. So yeah, like I said, I find that fascinating. But why? But then why do you think? And John, you can respond to this. Why do you think that she resigned suddenly? Do you believe her at her word that she was just too tired of the job, or?
Well, I'll speak on that, but I think firstly to discuss anything to do with COVID and the consequences, you have to look at the international context. One of the reasons that Ardern dropped, the largely successful policy, was there were enormous international pressures, political and economic pressures, on any nation that tried to continue them, particularly from the US. Look at how they managed China. China came under enormous pressure to drop its successful policies because the ruling elites internationally had a policy, to in the words of Boris Johnson, let the bodies pile high, and to have any example anywhere in the world where it could be eliminated was a contradictory and challenging phenomenon. So, decisions about whether to continue or discontinue COVID restrictions and other things were not sort of, were not contained within the national border. There were certainly there were pressures from big business, from the media, in particularly in Auckland, on Ardern to change course, but there were other factors at work, predominantly international ones. And I think that's also part of the answer to why did she go. and she's never really answered that question. As you say, she gave a very general description about how she'd sort of come to the end of her energy and so on. But again, this was an international thing, because the same year, after Ardern left, in Australia, for instance, there were several state Labor Party premiers who also resigned or left or got kicked out. There was Dan Andrews in Victoria. There was somebody in South Australia, Western Australia. And these were, I think what was behind this kind of international sort of wave of resignations of particularly Labor Party figures is the issue of internationalism. What emerged with COVID was that the world, there are no longer any national solutions to anything. Everything is a global question. And the editor of our editorial board chief, David North, has recently made this point in discussion with US students. He was asked, what's the difference between previous generations and this generation? And the point he made is that everything nowadays is a global issue. And I think, why can't, what's behind the sort of collapse of traditional social democratic laborism? It's that, social democratic laborism is based on the conception that there can be national solutions to global capitalism. And I mean, this has been sort of debunked now since the late 80s, when globalization really came in. I mean, that sort of undercut, the Labor Party agenda, certainly here with the Longy Douglas government and so on. But it really, COVID really brought it into sharp focus. That the whole, there are no longer any kind of reformist national solutions to global problems. And I think, whether they consciously, understood this or not, that was the sort of crisis confronting a whole layer of Labor leaders. And in that sense, Ardern was just the canary in the coal mine, for a whole series of resignations. Now, if you have a look, for instance, of the developments of the Labor Party in, say, Australia, Australia, the Australian Labor government under Albanese rose through the ranks in the Australian Labor Party as a left-winger, so-called left-wing operator in the Australian Labor Party. Mm-hmm. What's become of the Australian Labor government? It is now the most far-right, pro-war government in Australian history, a so-called left-wing. Look at what's happened in Britain with Starmer. Starmer, looks like going to take over as a Labor government that's absolutely steeped in the war in the Middle East, the war against Russia. Most recently, statements, saying that he would not hesitate to use a nuclear weapon. Again, a sort of a Labor figure. So what we have is a the sort of real rising to the surface now of the effects of global economics, global politics, and the drive to war. And that was fundamentally, what undermined, Ardern's position. After Ardern, as you say, Chris Hipkins came in. Yeah. He did a couple of decisive things. I mean, firstly, he continued the foreign policy, pro-US foreign policy, sent troops to UK to train Ukrainian conscripts and so on, backed the developments in the Middle East. But his first major policy statement leading into the elections was, we will not impose any wealth taxes. The incoming government will not impose any wealth taxes. Now, I mean, there were two audiences to that comment. One was the international money markets. He was reassuring the international money markets that a Labor government would not threaten the status quo. But the other audience was the working class. The working class, as a whole, came to realise, why would I vote for this party? in the middle of a social crisis, who was promising not to raise wealth taxes. And so what happened in the election? A million of them, a million people who were either eligible to enroll or eligible to vote didn't. So there was a complete collapse of the Labor vote in the last elections. The Labor vote went from 50% the election before down to 26%. And it wasn't because there was a sudden kind of shift of popular opinion towards the right. It was because, the Labor rights had lost all sort of backing or confidence among the working class. And so, I think there's a connection here, stretching, between, sort of Ardern's sort of final decision to say goodbye under these conditions and the demise of Labor at the last election.
Fascinating. And before I get to my second question, Thomas, the thing.
Oh yeah, well, no, I mean what John said is absolutely right, and obviously Ardern's explanation just was a non-explanation. It was, she didn't have anything left in the tank. And the pseudo-lefts, by the way, our political opponents in the International Socialist Organization put forward a totally ludicrous argument taken from the pages of the bourgeois media that Ardern had been hounded out of office by misogynists on social media, that she just couldn't take it anymore. There were too many sexist comments, too many sexist journalists in the press gallery. Ardern herself never said anything like that, by the way, but this was one of the explanations put forward in the media, to make it all a kind of identity politics issue, and again to suggest that somehow Ardern was a champion for women and people just couldn't tolerate that because the working class is so reactionary. I mean, that's the basic message that the middle class supporters of Labor always put forward, that the working class is ungrateful and they didn't understand what a wonderful leader Jacinda Ardern was. We rejected all of that, and I think just to underscore the point John has made, I mean, by the time Ardern resigned, which was she announced it in January last year, it was very clear that Labor was on course to lose the election. Its popularity had declined. So while she was still in power, there was no, I mean, and she could see that the writing was on the wall, and the party was clearly in a crisis, which is underscored by the fact that after she stepped down, there were four or five other Labour Party ministers who either resigned or were, some of them were demoted. But the whole party went through a bit of a purge as its popularity collapsed in the polls. And as John said, they ruled out any sort of wealth tax or any policy that might in any way alleviate the soaring cost of living. Was just completely anathema. And that's significant because in 2017, that was the key promise behind the Jacinda mania. Jacinda Ardern said capitalism had failed. Winston Peters of the New Zealand First Party also said that. That's why he had decided to form a coalition with Labor. Anyway, but Jacinda Ardern said her priorities were to address the housing crisis and homelessness and to end child poverty. And she
exactly. Exactly.
She became the Minister for Child Poverty Reduction, a new role that she created for herself. And child poverty went up under the Labor government. The absolute numbers increased of children living in impoverished households. So that was a complete fraud. And so was the promise to end homelessness. That has also significantly increased. And there are thousands of people in motels that have been converted into homeless shelters across the country. And yeah, the cost of living is totally out of control, largely fueled by all of the bailouts and pro-business policies that were carried out here during the pandemic, as they were in the US and Europe and everywhere else. So the Labour government was, I mean, what happened in the election was not some kind of swing to the right in the population. It wasn't that people were all misogynists and couldn't stand Ardern. I mean, if that was the case, then Labour might have recovered after she had left. But the point is that people recognised there was no real choice between Labour and National, and there was just massive abstention, and especially in working class areas that normally would vote for the Labour Party. People simply stayed home, and so that's the analysis that we've put forward of the Labour Party's collapse in the election. But there is another important point, which is that the election was on October the 13th. And of course, just 1 week earlier, or October the 14th, and 1 week earlier was the beginning of the genocidal assault by Israel against Gaza. And I think that did play a role, because Chris Hipkins, the Labour leader, immediately came out in support of Israel, as did every other political leader, condemning the Hamas attack or incursion into Israel, and saying that this was this bombing, indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, was a justified self-defense. And we did meet people at some of the protests who said, I was going to vote for the Labour Party, but I couldn't bring myself to do it because of their support for the Israeli war against Gaza.
Wow.
So,
wow.
And by the way, on that point, Jacinda Ardern, who by this time had moved to the United States and is still there working in some kind of fellowship at Harvard University, has basically said nothing about the Gaza genocide. She made one comment when she was asked about it last November, and it's one of the sort of meaningless statements that she specialized in, which was
in.
yeah, that's right. I mean, somebody on Twitter said, called her the Queen of the Platitudes, and anyway, she was asked in a forum at Harvard University about what she thought of the Israel's war against Gaza, and she said, quote, the only way to find long-term peaceful resolution to difficult and complex conflicts is if you find a way to end the violence and grief in order to give yourself the space to then have those conversations. So, I mean,
vague.
Well, it is a totally meaningless non-answer, but of the sort that she often gave while she was Prime Minister. And as far as I know, she hasn't said anything else. There are now protests erupting at Harvard University, where she is. I don't think she's said anything about that either. But it would be interesting if she did.
Wow, that is.
But this is the point. It's a pro-war, pro-imperialist party of big business, and all of that was very clear by the time the election happened. And even after the election, where there was about a month before the right-wing parties were able to decide on their coalition agreement. So Labour remained in power until about mid-November and or late November, and they continued to back Israel under Chris Hipkins basically until the end, and then finally made some mealy-mouthed call for a ceasefire. So it's still extremely unpopular in the polls and unlikely to recover anytime soon.
Wow, that the word fascinating does that's just the word that just keeps coming to my mind, given that there was unprecedented protests. I think in your I think in your country of New Zealand, nationwide, I think these were the largest protests that people have participated in since the pre-invasion of Iraq back in 2003, 2004, right? Or
yeah,
unbelievable.
Well, certainly the most the most sustained and widespread. Yeah, exactly. There have been at least two protests, as far as I know, where Labour Party MPs have tried to speak and been shouted down and booed off the stage. So
My God.
they're in a major crisis, and here is where the role of the Green Party and Te Pāti Maori is so significant, because they have been prominent at particularly the Green Party at these protests, and at one of them, which I attended, they introduced their Labour Party colleague, basically with the message to the crowd that we've all got to forgive and forget the fact that they just a few weeks ago were supporting Israel's war. Apparently, they'd now seen the light and should be welcomed at these protests.
And
So,
what was the response?
you know,
what was the response from the
well,
audience?
well, in that particular case, I don't think they were booed off the stage, but as I say, they were on other occasions. But you see, this is the thing about these other parties, that they perhaps are able to pose as slightly more progressive during elections. They put forward wealth taxes, and in the case of Te Pāti Maori, they even called for an end to the alliance with the United States, although that was not a major plank of their policy. But then they get up at these protests and try to rehabilitate the Labour Party in order to basically trap the working class within what is still a system dominated by two capitalist parties, and yeah, the whole parliamentary framework, which is increasingly under strain and discredited in the eyes of millions of people in every country. Yeah.
And that's a perfect segue then to my second question, which is the corporate media, state media's coverage of the election. Now, was the corporate state media of New Zealand surprised by this seemingly upset victory? And was the corporate state media more supportive of Labour and its coalition partners than the National Party? And please do explain why you feel whatever newspaper or magazine was supportive of Labour or neutral or supportive of a national comeback, if that was the case. And the reason why I also ask that is because I was trying to look at which newspapers and magazines endorsed Labour or endorsed the National Party or a kind of coalition, and I actually couldn't find any information even on Wikipedia. So, John, why don't you answer that, and then Tom's can answer that.
Yeah. Well, I think the first point to make is that the big money flowed towards the National Party and its far right allies, generally speaking. I mean, in 2017, 2020, Labor had some big donations and, quite a significant amount of funding, corporate funding. In the last election, most of that flowed back to the National Party and the right wing, and I think that sort of signified a sort of a shift in intentions by the ruling elite. I mean, I think the ruling elite as a whole had decided that the kind of gentler Labor government that they've been in for 60 years. It was time to draw it to a close. I mean, the kind of gentler Labor government was a product of the ruling elite in a sense. It was the strategy that it sort of chose to implement at that particular time. And then by last year's elections, I think that, they had decided, the ruling elite had decided that it was time to draw the curtain, as it were, on that stage of the assault on the working class. We should, I think, remember here that Labor had a lot of trouble controlling the upsurge of the working class and against the cost of living crisis. They, fundamentally depended on the trade unions to shut down. There were nationwide strikes by nurses, teachers, firefighters, and I think one of the issues behind the scenes, among the considerations about the election was that Labor couldn't do the job any longer, and it was time for a harsher government. Now, and they've got one, so yeah. I mean, the question of individual media is a bit more difficult. I mean, the right wing narrative is that the mainstream media is all left wing, and it's a complete fraud. What they mean by that is there's a certain concentration in the media on identity politics, particularly around questions of race and gender and so on, and this is depicted as a left wing sort of influence in the media, and there's all these discussions about, well, journalists are generally left wing. Well, it's a complete fraud. I mean, the media. The media is corporate owned. The state media, follows the line of the ruling elite on all these questions, and the identity politics sort of influence is not a left wing influence at all. So I think if you look generally at the commentariat. In like the New Zealand Herald and stuff and so on, the political commentators and the economics commentators, generally speaking, there was a shift generated from the ruling elite that it was time. Labor's time was well and truly up, and the basis of that was that that they were wanting to engineer a very sharp shift in class relations to a harsher government. Now, we now have one. It's been in office for just over 3 months, and it's been a tremendous shock. The policies that they've brought in just last week on one day, Wednesday of last week, there were 1,000 public service jobs lost, axed across two ministries in one day. In the last 3 weeks, there's been 3,500 public service jobs axed, by this government, who's driving down the numbers in the public service. And I think that the speed with which this policy and this agenda has been introduced has shocked enormous numbers of people. But the thing about it is that it's not a reversal of what Labor was doing. It's an extension, as I say. I mean, there was a point at which clearly the signals were, well, Labor's done its dash. It clearly was having trouble controlling the working class. There needs to be a harsher new austerity regime brought in, and that was the sort of decisive factor.
So Thomas, so continuing on with what John was explaining, so is it safe to say that the corporate newspapers and magazines and those columnists who get invited on TVNZ and which is the state media, but also corporate news outlets in New Zealand, was it safe to say that many of them they weren't hostile towards labor, but they were definitely not like but they were generally like okay with the prospects of, oh, I think labor's time is done. When the national comes in, it's time for a change, and so not really like an explicit endorsement like we at the New Zealand Herald, we endorse a national party, or us at such and such, we endorse labor. It was more like, well, voters, choose whoever you want, but yeah.
I think by the end of by the end of last year, it was becoming extremely difficult to maintain any pretense that Labour was, a progressive government, and there was a lot of commentary about that, and that people felt betrayed, and so on, by the broken promises, etc. I mean, just to give you an idea of the social crisis, which we've referred to, but I think it's important to give a sense of it. We're talking about 1 in 5 kids basically living in poverty, defined by less than half the median wage, after housing costs are deducted, and the absolute number of kids who are in households that can't afford basic necessities such as fresh fruit and vegetables and doctor's visits, etc., increased under Labour by 6.4%, to about 143,000 children. And the number of homeless people, or people living in severe housing deprivation, is a bit harder to know, but because the last survey was some time ago, but it's around 100,000 people. So that's about well over 1%, I think close to 2% of the population. And this, has all got worse under the Labour government. So there's that, and then but I think there was no real enthusiasm in the corporate elite for the National Party either. And its leader, Christopher Luxon, who has only recently become a politician. I mean, the National Party, all throughout the past 6 years, has been in a crisis of its own, with multiple leadership changes, and
sorry to interrupt, but we will get into this later. But didn't one of the leaders literally have like a nervous breakdown because factions of the deep states and the media thought that the National Party was too soft on China, was too cozy with Chinese capitalists and so forth, right?
Yes, well, that has been the persistent theme, dogging the National Party since before the 2017 election, when in 2016 the Prime Minister, John Key, suddenly resigned, in a way that was not all that different from Jacinda Ardern. He said much the same thing, I just want to spend more time with my family, etc. And no real explanation was given. But again, it can't be separated from the international context. And following his resignation, or around the same time, and leading up, in particular, leading up to the 2017 election, there was a whole wave of anti-Chinese hysteria coming from academics with close connections to the United States. And Marie Brady is a name that someone who became very prominent, attacking the National Party for being too close to China, and John Key in particular for his business ties, his close relationship. Apparently, he receives Christmas cards from Xi Jinping, and he's been denounced for that. And then there have been about four or five different leaders since then, one of whom did basically have a nervous breakdown. That was Todd Muller. He was only leader for a very short time, and anyway, we'll never know exactly what went on behind the scenes, but it is the case that the National Party had been more associated with building up close business ties with China. Now, so had the Labour Party. I mean, the Labour Party in 2008, I think, established a free trade agreement with China, and New Zealand was one of the first Western countries to do that, and so that has been, and since then, China has become New Zealand's most important trading partner, and still is. And that is still a tension within the ruling class. But yes, the National Party has been in crisis, and they have had leadership changes and departures of senior MPs, and in some way it is connected with these debates over foreign policy, which are largely behind the scenes. But that has been the key mechanism for the media to destabilize the National Party over the past few years. Now, what's taken place with this new government is that Winston Peters and the New Zealand.
Before we get into that, I just wanted to also ask this question before we shift to him, to Winston Peters, which is, so if I understood correctly, I had this question, which was, how much did the anti-vax extremists and COVID minimalist denialists play a role in Labour's defeat? And do you both feel this is a cautionary tale and red flag for more reactionary and misplaced anger in other countries? So hypothetically, if Pumpkinhead, dodgy Donald Trump, was to win over Biden, if many disaffected voters vote for RFK Jr. as a protest vote, although I don't get how that's a constructive protest vote, will that be because of COVID minimalism and COVID denialism I'm curious.
I think
on that.
I think one important point to make about the election outcome is that while there was certainly a shift to the right by the ruling elite, it has been unable to generate any enthusiasm for this generally. I mean, the outcome of the election for the current government was decidedly well, they haven't got any support at all. I mean, the National Party that leads the coalition got in the mid-30s, very low vote, and that was the most. The two far-right parties, ACT, I think, got 8%, around about 8%. New Zealand First got 6%. So what you've got is a far-right government with the leading party is extremely unpopular, and to sort of lead into the question you've just asked, the two far-right parties are both, widely, reviled really, among the population. But where they do get their support from is precisely some of the elements that you were just asking about. You know, there is no widespread support for, the COVID, COVID denialists and the, anti-vaxxers and so on. But they do congregate around these two far-right parties who have got far more influence in the government than they do in terms of the, in any popular support. So I think it would be. I think it would be a mistake to sort of overemphasize the influence of the sort of far right at the moment. It certainly exists, but the influence that it does exist is in this kind of, completely unrepresentative government that, didn't come in with a popular mandate, and even now is even losing support hand over fist because of its assault on the working class. So I think, the sort of elements that you've raised, one wouldn't want to dismiss them, but one wouldn't want to sort of overstate them either.
Well, that's good. Well, and then a follow-up.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, just to add to what John was saying, I mean, the Labour Party opened the door for all of this. I mean, they are responsible, as I explained earlier, for getting rid of all of the COVID elimination policies, and caving in to the far-right protesters who camped out on the lawn of Parliament in early 2022 for almost for 3 weeks or so. And this is a very small layer. I mean, the groups involved are, religious fundamentalists and sort of similar nutcases as you get supporting RFK Jr. and so on. We certainly have those, and they don't have mass support at all. But under conditions where there isn't a mass socialist party in opposition to Labour and the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, there's no, there's a political vacuum that the far right has taken advantage of. And that's what we are going to see in the American election, undoubtedly as well, if Donald Trump gets back into office. And Canada, and everywhere. I mean, actually, it's the same tendency everywhere. The Labour Party here adopted all of the demands of the extreme anti-vaxxers. There's no other way around it. I mean, they basically adopted their program of mass infection.
I know exactly where you're coming from, and the reason why I'm laughing out loud and laughing in my head about this is I remember the freedom. I remember the freedom convoy, emphasis on the word dumb and emphasis on the word con, in Canada, and I mean, like, you only have to do elementary research to know that this is a far right. This is a far right movement, a reactionary far right movement that weaponized people's legitimate concerns. But in general, it was a bunch of idlibs, idiot libertarians, and to see left-leaning, journalists and people who are great on anti-imperialism and so forth prop up this as like some kind of popular workers left-wing populist thing. It was just stunning, and of course these are the same kind of people who are now propping up this grifter RFK Jr. who doesn't have a left-wing bone in his body. I mean, he's no Bernie Sanders. He's no Dennis Kucinich. He's not even a Ralph Nader, and yet there are supposedly left-leaning people propping him up. But then I have to ask, how did the Green Party and the Maori Party fare in the last general election? And John, you can be however brief you want to be. However brief or long you want to explain go right ahead, and then Thomas, and then we can go to another question.
Well, the Green Party did increase their vote. I think they came in with about 12%. And to a certain extent, they benefited from sections of the sort of middle class who were disillusioned with Labor. I mean, where I live in Wellington, there were two previous Labor seats, Wellington Central and Rongotai, that were Labor seats that both went to the Greens. And I think it was certainly an expression of disillusionment with Labor, particularly amongst the more middle class and perhaps younger. The Greens made a particular line for younger voters. And as Tom mentioned, the Greens have also been prominent on the anti-war protests and so on. The Te Pāti Māori, the Māori Party, also increased their representation in Parliament by, I forget the figures, a couple of seats. And there's particular issues bound up with that, including the promotion of particularly identity politics around, Maori issues, but also, again, the failure of the Labor government to generally improve the lot of Maori, the Maori working class. Although Te Pāti Māori doesn't ever talk about the Maori working class. It's not it doesn't recognise class divisions. The Maori Party proclaims that that Maori are one people, and that's that's one of the essential questions of their political program. But they did benefit in that they did win a couple of seats from that were previously Labor held, through the fact that all of the statistics about Maori welfare, the plight of sort of poverty among Maori and Pacific Islanders continue after 6 years of Labor rule. And under circumstances where the Labor government had the biggest representation of Maori MPs in its caucus ever, it had over 20 Maori MPs in this. It was a Maori caucus that ran itself as a caucus, and that did nothing to improve the lot of working class Maori, and to a certain extent the Te Pāti Māori were able to benefit from that.
Interesting. That wow, very interesting. And that's a perfect segue to then this question, which is, what can we expect? So this is continuing on with what Thomas was explaining when he was talking about Winston Peters. So what can we expect with the National Party led by Christopher Luxon, with New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters, who's in coalition with them? He is the Deputy Prime Minister for a record third time. And again, let's remind our audience, NZ First is a far-right party. Peters is a Kiwi Maori version of Pauline Hanson of One Nation in Australia, and he's a Maori version of the indigenous people of Australia. But he champions regressive right-wing policies, which one can compare to One Nation, the Liberal National Coalition, and Labour. Correct me if I'm wrong. In terms of New Zealand's imperial foreign policy, he was also deputy for the deputy foreign minister, I believe. And yeah, and what can we expect? What can we expect in terms of imperialism? And I'm particularly interested in the Five Eyes Alliance, the pivot to Asia, and NATO, especially with the ongoing cluster F of a situation, which is Ukraine.
Well, I think there's a few points to make about it. I mean, as we were saying earlier, and you mentioned, Winston Peters, the leader of New Zealand First, was also the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister in the first Ardern government from 2017 to 2020. In the last election last year, Chris Hipkins, the Labour Party leader, repeatedly attacked New Zealand First as racist, which they certainly are. But the comeback to that as well, you've worked with them actually in two governments. There have been two Labour New Zealand First coalition governments, and now there have been two National and New Zealand First coalitions. And the New Zealand First, so the coalition government was formed after about 1 month of negotiations between the National Party, New Zealand First, and the ACT Party.
Yeah.
New Zealand First received 6% of the votes. Nevertheless, they are playing an extremely important leading role in the government. Winston Peters is in some ways a more prominent political figure than Christopher Luxon, and is certainly on the world stage, has been to the recent NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, and pledged to continue supporting the war against Russia in Ukraine, which New Zealand has involvement in training Ukrainians to fight. And then he went recently, just earlier this month, to Washington and pledged to further strengthen the alliance with the United States. The government has sent a small number of military personnel to assist with bombing Yemen, which is a criminal war, an expansion of the genocide in Gaza, and the part of the encirclement and provocations aimed at starting a war against Iran. So New Zealand is totally enmeshed in both of those wars, and also in the accelerating militarization of the Asia Indo-Pacific region. And this government appears to be very favorable to the idea of joining the AUKUS alliance, Australia, UK, United States alliance, which is aimed at primarily transforming Australia into a military base of operations for war against China. But also now Japan appears to be likely to join this, and also New Zealand, although decisions have not been finalized, but that appears to be what the government is doing. Of course, the Labour Party, when it was still the government, was also doing all of these things. I mean, participating in US imperialist wars and considering joining AUKUS. So what we have is a continuation of that, and the symbol of continuity between these two governments is Winston Peters and New Zealand First, and as the foreign minister. I mean, it's really hard to overstate. This is a very, very unpopular government, and the most unpopular parties within the government are the ones calling the shots, both New Zealand First and the ACT Party. I mean, they are setting the agenda for the war on the working class at home, the gutting of the public sector, all of these job cuts. Also, the things like the ACT Party is advocating cuts to school lunch programs for poor kids. They are doing that. The New Zealand First Party had a policy of scrapping sexuality and gender education programs in schools. So they were definitely appealing to that sort of audience. Yeah, the transphobes, etc., as well as the COVID denialists, and both those parties were also during the election and after, whipping up a kind of anti-Maori bigotry, which they are still doing. I mean, it takes bizarre
but I find that quite shocking, given Winston Peters' background as a Maori person. So what? So how do you explain that logic? And I assume, John, I already can hear your voice in my head, and I assume that has a lot to do with class, right? Nothing to do with. So yeah. So yeah. Do you want to respond to that, actually?
Well, there's certainly a layer of the Maori, well, there is a class system within Maori society, and in fact, there is some evidence that the gap between the wealthiest Maori and the Maori working class is wider than in the general community. So there is a definite class division within Maori, and Peters has always been, a representative of big business. I mean, the anti-immigrant strain is actually a long-standing thing in the Maori nationalist movement. The argument of the Maori nationalists is that we were here first, and we're not having immigrants come in and take our place, or sort of take resources that belong to us. And so that the whole kind of anti-immigrant push really rears its head very often amongst sort of Maori nationalist politicians. And Winston Peters
and there's been like a new wave of xenophobia, which of course is linked to the whole pivot to Asia. The whole xenophobia of like Chinese working class, middle class, rich Chinese are coming up and buying up all the property and jacking prices.
Yeah. Well, it's not just that. I mean, one of the previous leaders of the Maori Party, and we wrote on this, demanded the execution of Chinese drug smugglers, and with the emphasis on Chinese. It was a really sort of a racist, authoritarian reaction to immigration. Now, Peters has always fed into that, but I mean, just another point about Peters is that he is a Washington asset. He was installed in the Labor government in 2017 after the intervention of the US ambassador in Wellington, who basically said that he backed a Labor government because he said the Nats were too soft on China. And so what happened was that Labor came in, they reached the agreement with Peters, installed Peters as the foreign minister, and as Tom said, it's now become a permanent position. So that's one of the other issues around Peters, is that he's a nationalist, he's an asset of the United States. But just to return to the issue of sort of the Maori political question, is that it's, for a start, it's totally reactionary, because it's based on this conception that a nationalist conception, that Maori were here first, everybody else are visitors, or latecomers, that there has to be, special sort of privileges for the Maori population. As I said, they totally will not acknowledge that there are social class divisions within Maori society itself. There is this sort of constant drumbeat that the foundation of New Zealand is, the Treaty of Waitangi, which is in fact the treaty. What did it do? It established capitalist property and class relations in New Zealand. It wasn't a progressive document at all. It was bound up with the imposition of sort of imperialist Britain in New Zealand. But this is now the totem It's become the sort of touchstone of New Zealand nationalism. One has to honour the treaty is now the catch cry now for a whole chunk of last century. The catch cry was that the treaty was a fraud, which is quite correct. But there's now a whole layer of business people, quite wealthy, very wealthy tribal businesses that have benefited from payouts and so on, who are very right wing.
And Peters is a product of that. Then Peters is
well, not exactly. I mean, he's something of an outlier, and he is regarded with some suspicion by the current crop of Maori politicians, because I mean he does say he does criticise, for instance, the what he calls the Maori elite. He recognises that there's a Maori elite, but he doesn't think he's part of it. He's made his way in bourgeois politics by kind of appealing to a different constituency and so on. So there are those.
So there's a fake grifter / populism to this, and I actually think that us lefties, we need to take back populism, because populism was originally associated with a left-wing movement in the United States that believed in power from the ground up, not progressivism, which is changed from the top down. But that's a whole other issue for another day. But Peters is that kind of grifter right winger who will say, who, as you say, he'll attack the elites even though he's literally a part of the elites. Trump does this all the time. Pierre Poilievre in Canada does this, and Nigel Farage of Reform UK always does this. Even Rupert Murdoch, who loves the establishment, and I believe John Pilger said that Murdoch, off the record, once called himself a capitalist version of Karl Marx. But Murdoch is like. Yeah, no, but yeah, Murdoch is like hardcore, like elitist to the core, as is Conrad Black. They're just much more on the fiscal conservatism, extreme Austrian school of economics thought, as opposed to some liberal or some One Nation Tory. Correct?
Well, as Tom said, I mean, Peters has now been a central part of two National Party-led governments and two Labor Party governments. I mean, governments in New Zealand come and go, but Peters remains because he's an operator, and he has never claimed to represent the Maori, the Maori community as such. His big pitch for many years was to elderly voters. Particularly, he's maintained a pitch towards maintaining, benefits for elderly people and so on. But as I say, he has been something of an outlier in terms of, the sort of later, the later versions of Maori nationalism, and he's never made an appeal to that. So the fact that he happens to be Maori is of some significance, but it's not a defining, it's not a defining characteristic, I don't think.
Reminds me very much of Cruella, Coward Woman. I'm sorry, Suella Braverman of Rishi Sunak, Priti Patel, and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that yes, no. The point to make is that on all sides of the political establishment, in different ways, they have sought to make race the issue that continually must be raised and debated, and at the forefront of every discussion on social issues, and in the most divisive way possible. And both the Labour Party and now that the new government are doing this in their own way. Previously, well, it's still a lot of it is anti-immigrant demagogy, but there's also periodically attempts to whip up racism towards Maori and racial identity politics on the other hand, which feed off each other. So the last government, the Labour government, sought in numerous ways to further sort of elevate the role of the Maori tribal capitalists, to give them more say in the allocation of water resources, for example, or to establish Maori seats in local councils, and to establish a separate Maori health authority. And so in a kind of right-wing backlash against this, the New Zealand First Party and the ACT Party have denounced all of this as separatism and have sought to have attempted to claim that this is all leading to a situation where Maori are going to be privileged over everybody else. Which is not, not true, obviously. I mean, the fact is that Maori are an oppressed layer, by and large, an oppressed layer of the working class. But as John said, there is also a Maori capitalist layer which has benefited from identity politics, from including affirmative action, various quotas that government departments have where they have to do business with Maori entities, and all sorts of other arrangements that the tribes have with the government. So in order to, as you say, to sort of have this fake populist appeal, the New Zealand First Party has denounced the Maori elite, and the Libertarian ACT Party has said, this is like apartheid, and various sort of inflammatory things like that, which resonate with a small number of people, and again, it's the basic problem is in New Zealand that apart from us, apart from the Socialist Equality Group, there's nobody that opposes both sides of this reactionary debate. There's nobody who opposes the identity politics crowd, represented by the Maori Party and the Labour Party and the Greens, as well as the racists in New Zealand First and the ACT Party, which we say working people have got to oppose all of these parties and unite against them, regardless of workers' race or gender or nationality, on the basis of their common class interests. I mean, that's the fundamental principle that we fight for in New Zealand against this whole avalanche of racial politics, which can get really ridiculous. I mean, in the lead up to the election last year, there was a whole debate about the Maori language being used on road signs and whether this was going to cause confusion and maybe cause traffic accidents or something. And the New Zealand First Party seized on the fact that there are all of these Maori names that are now being used for government agencies, and we need to go back to using English names. And this just became, primarily a major diversion from all of the class questions, that the vast inequality that exists, and the fact that all of these parties represent the rich. I mean, that's the purpose of it.
Well, that's a perfect segue to sure, no problem. John has to. Anyways, actually, that's a perfect segue to this question. Now, John, you have to leave in 15 minutes, so So the next time we have you on, you have to answer the Inside the Actor Studio questionnaire, okay?
No,
But
won't do it.
But okay, but before you go, that's a perfect segue to this question, which is your organization, the Socialist Equality Group. Where do you see yourselves going from here, given that much of the left in New Zealand props up the Labour Party? If they don't prop up the Labour Party, they prop up the Greens, who become partners in crime to the Labour Party. So where do you so where do you guys see the left going from here to end this reign of terror? And because because parties like yourself face such enormous odds against corporate media, state media, and those on the left who don't agree with your approach to this and that, do you see the Socialist Equality Group as being more of an organization which advocates for left-wing policies and hopes that other left-wing groups and people power movements adopt those in order to advance a left movement and to push back against the reign of terror that is capitalism and whatnot? I'm curious your response to that. It's a question I've asked friends of mine who are part of communist parties. Forgive me that some of my friends are Stalinists. But it's a question I've asked, like other like alternative left, left parties. So I'm curious, John, your response on that before you have to go.
Well, we don't appeal to sort of pseudo-left or middle-class leftist groups. I mean, we don't agree with this general conception that there's a sort of a loose left-wing network out there who can somehow influence each other or get together. I mean, it's fundamentally a class question. We address ourselves to the international working class. Okay, that's our orientation, and we are very confident. We are in a revolutionary period. Make no bones about that. And we said that at the turn of the decade. We are now in a revolutionary period, and what we mean by that is that there is a growth of the international class struggle, and that's where we orient to. Now, there are various, there's huge number of signs about the change in the situation. There are enormous class struggles erupting all around the world, in Europe, in the US, in parts of Asia, that we are oriented to. We haven't had a chance much to talk in this session about what's going on in the United States this week, but the eruption of mass protests against war in the US is a harbinger, if you like, of struggles to come. I mean, traditionally, if you look at revolutionary situations, a movement amongst the youth is a sign of things to come. Now, the decisive question facing the young people who are faced with a fascist race response from the Biden government is to make a connection with the working class. The working class is the real social force that can change society. Now, as I say, this kind of conception that there's a sort of a left-wing aura out there somewhere amongst the middle class is completely mistaken. I mean, as Tom's pointed out, the sort of pseudo-left groupings have gone further and further to the right. Many of them support the Ukraine against Russia. The general sort
many of them support the pivot to Asia, and regardless of the betrayals of a Bernie Sanders or of a Jeremy Corbyn, or of AOC or of or of NDP leaderships. Not talking about the NDP members, many of them who are, you know, good folks and so forth, but NDP, but people in positions of power. So yeah,
I think AOC, the Democratic Socialists of America, are a case study. I mean, AOC was brought forward as a voice of anti-establishment Democratic Party, and where she ended up in the last week voting for the war credits, and so these outfits are not oriented towards the revolutionary mobilization of the working class. What they're oriented towards, as capitalism goes into crisis, is supporting their own position, their own sort of upper middle class position within the economic and political framework. And so, I mean, we reject those politics, and we, put forward, as I say, the question of the mobilisation of the working class on an international basis, and that requires a globally based revolutionary party, and that's where we're, that's where we're oriented, and that does require the really the expose of a lot. The working class needs to know who its real friends and enemies are, and some of the fake friends of the working class exist in these Stalinist. I wouldn't boast about having too many Stalinist friends, actually. Stalinism is responsible for some of the great historical crimes of the 20th century. I mean, Stalinism was the prop of capitalism right through the crisis of the mid 20th century. So I think I would closely advise against sort of close relations with Stalinists can lead to all sorts of political problems. But anyway, Tom perhaps can.
Okay, and actually, John, you have to go now, right?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Okay, then one last thing I want to ask from you is your thoughts on the passing of John Pilger, who was a good friend to the World Socialist websites.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was a very important opponent of war, very courageous, and also a very strong supporter of Julian Assange. And I think he was principled. We had political differences with him, but fundamentally he was he was an honest, principled, and courageous journalist. And there are many journalists who could learn a lot, from the stands that he took.
John, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to having you back on in the future, okay?
Thank you very much. Yeah. Bye.
All right. And Thomas, we're almost done. So we're almost done. So instead of talking about like the state, just in general, respond to some of the stuff that that I was asking about. Okay, so the Socialist Equality Group. I know that you guys aren't a political party, but you guys are a political organization, a Trotskyist organization, whatnot. Okay, but I pose this question to you. It's the same question I've asked to friends of mine who are in the Communist Party of Canada, friends of mine who are in the Communist Party of Ireland, and also people who are part of the Green Party in the U.S., Party for Socialism and Liberation, and so forth. Now, so because the Democrats keep winning, because Labor keeps winning, and because this is the ghastly situation we're in, where marginalized people, the working class of all backgrounds, all have to choose between lesser evilism or as Glenn Ford would say, the more effective evil. Should groups like the Socialist Equality Group of New Zealand, which is a great example because so many of the left groups in New Zealand have gaslit and betray the very people they claim that they represent. So, should the Socialist Equality Group? Do you think that that you should just be more of an advocacy organization in which you have in which you produce platforms, you produce studies, and you hope that other left groups will adopt them and push those policies forwards? That will advance a left movement, and that will certainly push back against the endless right wing capitalist terrorism that we're all subjected to. I'm curious your response on that.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything John said about the similar question. I think no, we completely reject lesser evilism and the idea that you can pressure the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, or indeed the Labour Party leadership here, has been disproven, I think, most graphically over the past 6 or 7 months. I mean, where in response to the most significant worldwide protest movement to stop the genocide in Gaza, the response of the ruling class is to crack down, to carry out mass arrests, to censor and to demonize the protests, and to escalate their funding and support for this war. So in other words, the response to pressure from below is to embrace police state methods and accelerate the preparations for world war. That doesn't mean we don't. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we are against protests or anything like that. But the question is, what's the purpose of them? What's the political perspective behind them? And I mean, a key, I guess, a principle of the socialist movement is to tell the working class the truth, which includes the truth about the fact that capitalist parties are going to betray you and sell you out, and you should have no illusions about that. I mean, I'd encourage your viewers to look up an article on our site called with the headline David North answers questions at Wayne State University on the Gaza genocide and the fight for socialism, which includes a number of videos of David North responding, the editor of the World Socialist website. And one of the questions he was asked was about what to do in the election and whether there should be any case for supporting the Democrats as a lesser evil. And he said, well, this is a quote, when you tell workers to vote for Biden, you are accepting responsibility for the consequences. So if the day after the election, or even in the midst of it, Biden escalates the war against Ukraine or sends more bombs or allies himself with Israel in a war against Iran, what is the oversight? Well, you're responsible for it. What have you done to prepare the working class for that eventuality? And he continued, when an election comes, we don't drop our principles. Our politics during an election is consistent with our politics before the election. We are a party of principles, of historical conceptions, not of pragmatic short-term results. So for us, the election is an opportunity. We use it to carry out the absolutely essential work of political education. That's our method, as Trotsky said, to educate workers on what they must save and what they must overthrow. And that sums up our, I mean, we, the Socialist Equality Group, is fighting in New Zealand to build a party as a section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution. That's our goal, and we tell workers the same thing that Trotsky did in the founding program of the Fourth International, that outside of this movement there is no other revolutionary tendency worthy of the name, and that's the case, and we have certainly seen that in the here in the kind of support given to Jacinda Ardern from every other tendency on the so-called left, and in the United States in the support of the DSA and others for the Biden administration. And so yeah, from our standpoint is that there's no short-term solution to the crisis of capitalism. There's no reforming capitalism, and we have to tell workers the truth about that. What I wanted to do before we finished was to encourage your viewers to attend our upcoming international online May Day rally, which the World Socialist website has been holding. Yeah,
it's the pandemic.
Yes, I hope you will tune in. Well, we've actually been holding it, I think, since 2011 as a global event to reclaim the traditions of May Day, and to use it as an occasion for seeking to build workers' consciousness about the level of the capitalist crisis, the dangers of the World War, which we're in the opening stages of a third World War, the dangers of dictatorship and fascism, but also the real possibility and the reasons that we are optimistic, that there is a resurgence of class struggle, there is a mass movement, whatever the problems and confusions, there is certainly a movement against war, and it has to be turned to the working class, and it has to adopt a revolutionary socialist perspective and program. We're not going to change the capitalists' minds. Basically, we have to overthrow the system, and there's no, once workers realize and understand the power that they have, we're confident that we are in a revolutionary period. We've made this point about the Gaza genocide, that people do feel somewhat powerless. Certainly at the protests that I've been to, you speak to people who will say, look, we're being totally ignored. What can we do? We know that it's sort of ineffectual to call on right-wing politicians to bring about a ceasefire, but what else can we do? Well, the answer lies in the working class, and in turning to forces who can take action to shut down the war machine, to hold general strikes, to stop loading ships that are going to Israel, to shut down the weapons producing factories, and that is that's what we are saying to that's what our comrades are saying to these students who are protesting and occupying the campuses in the United States, and that's what we say everywhere that we're active. So yeah, so if you want to learn more about the Trotskyist movement, which I strongly encourage you and your viewers to do, please attend our online International May Day rally, and I can share the link for that, or just go to the World Socialist website and you'll see it there. It's on May the 4th in most parts of the world. It's May the 4th or May the 5th in some parts of the world.
Second to last question, your thoughts on the passing and the legacy of my hero, John Pilger, If not for John Pilger, by the way, I would have never ever have discovered the World Socialist website and countless other left wing news outlets that Pilger on his own website suggested. If you want to be informed, check out these websites. So your thoughts on the very sad passing of my hero John Pilger, who was a very good friend to the World Socialist website, and
yeah, well, he was a very, as John was saying, a significant journalist, one of the last journalists who really told the truth about American imperialism and the wars. Certainly, he was marginalized for doing so by all of the major news outlets, but he told he told the truth about the war in Ukraine, for example, the fact that began in 2014 with a coup spearheaded by fascists backed by NATO, and as John was saying, he was a very strong supporter of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who is still his life is in danger as he is still possibly going to be deported to face trial and imprisonment in the United States for revealing war crimes. And that's the origin of where our movement collaborated with John Pilger in the fight to free Julian Assange. And he spoke at some of our party's rallies in Australia, and made very powerful and principled appeals on behalf of Assange. So I think in many ways he's significant because he was such an exception to the rule of where what he called Vichy journalism. That was a phrase he used to describe the mainstream media.
Which he specifically used for the Guardian. I was so I was so happy when he
Yes.
he did that.
Exactly. And if he was around now, I mean, he was, I think, in the beginning stages of the genocide that was unfolding now, and made some very important statements about what was taking place, what was being done to the Palestinians, and in opposition to the avalanche of media propaganda which we're now witnessing. So it is a real loss. We, as John said, he was not a socialist in the sense that he never wanted to identify himself as such, I don't think. But he certainly was someone who had principles
And
and stood by them.
He was also a good friend to this community and to all communities like them, indigenous people, and and
Yep.
And actually, just before we end, I think it's a good time to wrap up the program. So, but just before we end the program, we usually end the program doing the questionnaire, which was done by Marcel Proust, later the popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and later the late James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. And Thomas, it's your turn to do this before we wrap up, so here goes. What is your favorite word?
What would when you spoke with any of my other comrades, did they have to do this quiz?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, what's my favorite word? I've never thought about this before. So it's really difficult to answer. I'll just, I mean, obviously we've been talking. I guess it's socialism.
Okay, perfect. What's your least favorite word then?
Oh. There's a lot of overused words.
Okay.
As someone who writes a lot of articles, I try to not overuse words, and whenever I do, I sort of catch myself out, and also the passive tense and things like that, passive constructions. I can't think of anything in particular right now, but
Yeah, so that would
yeah, we have to.
So would that be a word like and so or something like that, or
Oh, like yeah, there's just words that I sort of catch myself using too much. I guess amid, for example,
okay.
amid is one of them. Um,
Okay, then
yeah, and while starting a sentence with while is something I probably need to cut down on. While such and such, does such and such, someone
you would
else
be
is
a
doing
very
something else.
you would be a very great English teacher and journalism teacher. But then, what sound or noise do you love? Followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
What noise? Hmm.
So a sound or noise that
Gosh,
you
this is
love and a sound or noise that you dislike.
well. I am a fan of Motown music, like the Supremes, for example. Um,
Okay, awesome.
I I guess I dislike most much else. It's hard to pick anything, but most popular music of today. Um,
Really?
yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I haven't thought about these questions, as you can see.
Okay,
So
alrighty. So, but you love good like soul music from like the '60s and '70s then, and not so much
well,
like
yeah.
okay, interesting.
Right,
Well,
but not limited to that. I have broad tastes, but generally most stuff being produced now. I mean, I'm not kind of keeping up with it, so there may be great things I'm missing out on.
okay, no problem. Then what turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally? Like what like inspires you?
This is a very difficult. I mean, many things. But uh, but since I mean, have you read much Trotsky?
Uh, nope, I haven't. I'll admit I haven't.
All right, well,
Get
all right,
started
well,
then.
well,
But
in addition to being, yeah.
actually, let me interrupt you just for this 1 second. There's a quote of Leon Trotsky I really like. Uh, actually, I have to uh, while I'm looking for it, explain why it's Trotsky who turns you on creatively, emotionally, spiritually.
Well, Trotsky, in addition to being the founder of the Fourth International and uh, the leader of socialist internationalism, the fight for world revolution against the betrayals of the Stalinists, was also a brilliant writer uh, and widely recognized as such during his own lifetime, um, not just by Trotskyists, but he was, in many ways, a literary genius. And I think if you read books like his autobiography, My Life, you'll recognize that as well. He was, a profoundly objective and scientific historian, but also, yeah, had a wonderful style and psychological insight, including into people such as Stalin. He wrote a brilliant biography of Stalin, which was unfinished when Trotsky was murdered by a Stalinist agent. Um, but I would highly recommend all of his works. Both politically, of course, first and foremost, to understand the whole course of the 20th century. I don't think you can really do that without a grasp of Trotsky's analysis of how the revolution was betrayed in Russia, how Hitler came to power in Germany, how the Spanish Revolution was betrayed, how the 1925-27 Chinese Revolution was betrayed. All of these questions, which are vitally important today for orienting oneself politically, were dealt with in the most incisive way by Leon Trotsky, and there's scope for a discussion about that. I mean, I guess that's just a recommendation, but that I can make.
Well, I will definitely, I will definitely. It's going to be on my long list of books I need to get, and but if I do stumble upon it, I will definitely get it. No questions asked. But yeah, before I get to the rest of the question there, he said this, which I really liked. Natasha, that was his wife. Natasha has just come up to the window from the courtyard and opens it wider so that the air may enter more freely into my room. I can see the bright green strip of grass beneath the wall and the clear blue sky above the wall and sunlight everywhere. Life is beautiful. Let the future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence and enjoy it to the full. And it's that quote that inspired Roberto Benigni's film, and the title of that film, La Vita è Bella, Life is Beautiful. So,
oh, really? I did not know that, but that's very interesting, and that is a wonderful quote, I believe, from his testament. And you have to remember in reading that he knew that he was going to likely die very soon. He was being hunted by Stalinist agents, and also had health problems, and that many of his family had been murdered, including his children, and he'd been driven into exile. This was, nevertheless, despite all of that, he maintained a revolutionary optimism, even as the Second World War was erupting, and that's he was a remarkable political leader, the most his assassination by Ramon Mercader, organized by the Stalinists, was really the great crime of the 20th century, and it deprived the working class of its best political leader, really.
Well, after after giving that answer, I will definitely have to get the books that you suggested. So, what turns you off then? That's what turns you on. But then, what turns you off?
Well, I guess the vast majority of what's produced in academia, in my own study, I was an English literature student, and I
can tell. It's not
that it's all it's not that it's all bad, but the way that postmodernism has taken over the universities is extremely extremely reactionary, and essentially has what's the word? Yeah, produced some extremely bad writing. I mean, one could say a lot more than that, but the falsification of history.
the expression John Pilger often used to describe journalists at the Guardian, and just like in general, like British journalism and so forth, was windbags. And I feel like a lot of
Yeah.
and I feel like a lot of academia, when I was in university, I dropped out of my first university. I couldn't complete my studies at my second university. But some of the stuff that like the schools made us, some of the stuff that the teachers made us read, like that's like perfect word to describe it. Waste of ink, waste of oxygen, and windbaggery.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so then, what's your favorite curse?
So what?
That's the other
Yes.
one. What's your
Well,
favorite curse word?
look. I really. Gosh, it's Yeah. No, I can't. I've never thought about this. I should have. I should have, because you sent out these questions. I know, but no, I don't have a good answer to that. Sorry.
F bomb?
It's
An F bomb? A good F bomb?
Well, no, that's not very creative, is it? There's no, I think the Spanish actually have some good ones that are really more creative than, or they seem that way anyway. I don't want to say them on on here, but there's
Okay.
there's various ones that are really quite vulgar and but inventive. Yeah. Mm.
Alrighty. And what profession would you love to do? So if you weren't doing the brilliant journalism and political education that you engage in, as well as the activism, what would you like to do?
Well, something to do with writing and teaching, really. I mean, that is what we do, of course. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, um, uh, and that indeed that's what Trotsky aspired to do as well, to be a writer, and that's if that's what he did, but of course combined with political analysis and leading the Russian Revolution, and uh, yeah, so I think that yeah, I mean, to go back to your question of what inspires me, I guess it is uh, the situation that the world is entering into now, and the shift that is underway in the working class. Uh, I've had some very inspirational, if you want to call it that, discussions with people at some of the protests over the genocide in Gaza. I think it's very refreshing to see, and inspiring to see what's happening right now at these campuses in the United States. And of course, it is absolutely in response to the horrific events in Gaza. Um, but there are many reasons to be optimistic. Not that anything is going to um, be resolved automatically or spontaneously without political perspective and leadership. But what we have seen, what we are seeing is a real leftward shift in the population, in among young people and workers in particular. We recently had an article on New Zealand, on a survey in New Zealand, which found that 2/3 of people believe the system is rigged in favor of the rich and powerful, and only about 28% were in favor of spending more on the military. So those sorts of things I do find encouraging, and
And then, what profession would you
you,
absolutely not want to do under any circumstances, Len?
oh well, well, obviously, you know, whenever I meet anyone, which is not often, but you do run into people who are in the armed forces, I say, well, get out while you still can. And yeah, I guess that's my answer to that.
Okay, and
Or
then
anything to do with the state.
and then final question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, please do answer this question.
Well, it's really impossible to answer, and yeah, you can't, because how do you, even supposing that's true, how do you actually come up with a satisfying you know, sentence or phrase to sum up a person's life at the end of it? I don't know. It's not really. Yeah, I mean, I'd have to give that some more thought, but I don't think I could come up with something. Sorry.
Okay. Well, if the answer ever comes up, you know exactly where to reach me, and I'll put it in the show notes. Well, we well, we were joined on this
Yeah. So.
fantastic epic edition of 1+1 with Thomas Peters and John Braddock, both members of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, both contributors to the World Socialist website where they cover New Zealand topics. And Thomas, thank you so much for coming back on the program. It is Friday. Yes, it is Friday. Sorry, I'm still awake from Thursday. You have a fantastic weekend. I look forward to you coming back on the program. You give my best to Chris Marston. In England, you give my best to Oscar Grenfell and to Nick Beams, and keep up the great work that you and John are doing in New Zealand. And you have a fantastic weekend. And again, thank you so much for this. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Youri. It's a pleasure to speak to you again. So and yeah, good luck with your show, and I'm sure we will speak again in future.